And then from what we understand, you're also working on a project on co-volcanic societies around Mayon. What do you mean by this quote unquote co-volcanic studies?
Yeah, so this is one of the which is I've just I think just about coming to an end of this project. So I've published a number of papers
Mm.
on it. Now, what I mean by co-volcanic societies, I mean, I think it's fairly obvious in many respects that the dangers of living close to a volcano and also the attractions. People go there because the soil is good and rich. They're aware of the dangers, and the agricultural production is too high or too beneficial for them to ignore it. And even when, like around Mayon, you have a 6-kilometer danger zone where people are not meant to live, but they do really, of course. I mean, and even if you move people out, they tend and resettle them somewhere else. There's a drift back into because the soil is just too rich. So what I was trying to do with Co-Volcanic Society is look at how the volcano affects human societies, which is fairly obvious in many ways, but I mean, it's interesting to look at that. But then to actually think how also turn it the other way around. How do human societies affect the volcano? Now, obviously, they don't affect the timing of an eruption, but actually human activity can, or the effects of human activity can have a large effect on influencing the flow of lava, the lahars, and how far they spread and where they go. So, Mayon, I chose Mayon because it's the most frequently erupting volcano in the Philippines. And again, to dwell on this point, it's not just the major eruptions, it's living close to something that is likely to erupt every 5 years in one way or another. That it erupts very frequently. And so I wanted to think where that relationship between people and volcanoes was very strong. And what I found was that around Mayon, that you can look historically in the sense that the spread of agriculture increasingly encroaching nearer and nearer to the volcano meant that deforestation occurred very rapidly. So there are almost no trees anywhere around there, and lahar and lava flows are actually affected by tree coverage. Of course, it doesn't stop it, but it slows it down, so it doesn't spread as far. Remove the tree cover, and bingo, you have lahars and lava that flows much more widely and affects a much wider area. There's even evidence that in the past, some people built dikes to protect their own fields or their own property from lahar and lava flows, and just directed into somebody else's. So while you don't, in a sense, lessen but you redirect it in certain ways. And that's very interesting. I mean, the way that these dikes, I haven't found, unfortunately, any evidence of them historically, still there around the volcano, but they must be there. There must be ways of actually doing this in a more concerted ways, but you're going to need LiDAR and certain other kind of science skills and technological devices to actually be able to do this. But it should be possible to do that. The way roads are built, and that was very interesting, that nobody thinks of roads or train tracks as being actually, in terms of the lahar and lava, the equivalent of riverbeds. And if you build a road that goes straight up or in a straight line close to the volcano, then you're likely to get a whole lot of lava and lahar just flowing all the way down it. And since those are the main routes of escape for people, you're actually channeling lahar and lava straight at population flows at the same time. And it was interesting when I interviewed an engineer, a civil engineer that worked for the Department of Public Works and Highways. And I said to him, when you're constructing a road, do you ever think of them as being, like riverbeds? And he said, "Oh God, no. No, it never occurred to us that they might act in that way, but they clearly do." So I was interested in this interaction. So it's not just the volcano affecting people, but people affecting the course of eruptions too. And that's what I called a co-volcanic society. Do we have something around Mayon where it's erupting so frequently, where this is a frequent event, that we can actually see the interaction of people and volcano in a much more interesting and interrelated manner, not simply as just cause and effect.
That's certainly interesting. It didn't occur to me that, the activities of people can actually affect how an eruption
takes place. Not when it takes place.
Out,
Obviously, there's no effect on when it takes place, but yes. How? And that's the interesting thing. And I think you can apply this much more. Well, I'm sure there are other ways. There are even intellectual ways too, because now Mayon, for instance, is designated as is it a national park or and that means that nature is supposed to be allowed to reestablish itself. So again, just the way we even classify things, because it's so iconic, it's a beautiful volcano. When I was doing a lot of my research, was in January 2018, so I had the benefit, not for me, not for everybody else, of course, of actually being stuck there as an eruption occurred. So I could, in a sense, I was going around interviewing people as an eruption was taking place. And the methodology I was using, which is Transect Interviews, which is, so I went around with a volcanologist around the whole volcano, talking to people, getting him to interpret the landscape I was looking at. Fascinating, because he'd be able to say to me, there you can see the 1814 eruption. It's like a book to him, and it's like a document for us, and that was really interesting. So he can read the landscape in a way that I can't, and that's where I think it's wonderful to have that kind of interdisciplinary work.
Well, that should have been an experience being there while the eruption taking place.
Well, and actually watching all the, suddenly my hotel, which had nobody in it, was absolutely full, and the proprietor would say, "When are you going?" Because he obviously could get more money for my room, because all these people were coming in as tourists to look at the volcano, especially at night. And there's I can have a little plug here for, well, I won't mention the coffee bar. Sure. There's a coffee bar on the top of a mall in the middle of Legazpi City, where you can go out onto their balcony with your cappuccino and watch the volcano erupt. It's a very surreal kind of experience.
And now we see the intersection of calamities and capitalism.
Absolutely. But it was, so I was filming people watching the volcano erupt as they drank their coffee and had their donut.
One surreal experience.
Wonderful. Yeah.
And now, finally, in terms of the current project that you're in, you're working also on urban fire in Manila in the first decade of the 20th century. Although we understand you have not started writing this, but you have already collected all the data. So any preliminary idea of how you intend to frame this project, or perhaps interesting details that you can share from the data that you have gathered?
Well, I have, of course, worked on urban fire in Manila before. So there was a book called Flammable Cities, which I co-edited 10 or so more years ago, where I was looking at fire in the Spanish period, in the 19th century in particular. And so I have had quite a lot of experience of looking at fire in Manila. And in a sense, the earlier work was interesting because it showed that quite clearly there were two cities. There was the Intramuros, the city of stone, and some of the suburbs around, increasingly places like Binondo and such like, that were becoming more readily built in what the Spanish would call hard materials as opposed to light materials. And then you had this other city, and the other city was very flammable because it was mainly wood or nipa and cane, and it burnt regularly and such like. So you had this sort of kind of duality between the two, and there were also clearly different techniques for fighting fires. So and to the extent that the Spanish authorities really clearly couldn't understand what was going on, because local people wouldn't fight fires. They were reluctant to fight. They had actually, in some cases, the Spanish had to use troops to make people fight fires. And of course, what we're getting here is a completely different way of dealing with fires, because in many respects, there's different. I mean, if you would like to call it Spanish, the Western technology is to isolate fire, to build in hard and non-flammable materials as much as possible, and to fight them and to contain them, and it's to protect property. If you're the owner of a nipa and cane hut or house, the actual structure itself is not that valuable. It's the contents that are valuable. And so it's very easy to actually take your contents and get out of the way of the fire. And why would you risk your life or possible injury fighting something that you can put up in a day or two or replace quite easily anyhow? It's not. And that's what I call a disposable tech. So it's a technology as well, but it's a disposable technology. And again, it's not unique to the Philippines. Perhaps the most obvious example is its use in Japan, and the whole way in which traditional Japanese houses were structured. So, as I said, I've written a couple of articles on that, but then I was lucky enough to discover a source of materials in the archives for the first decade of the American period, where the Americans, of course, are clearly coming in and they want to. I mean, the Spanish had done already a reasonable job of establishing a fire service in Manila in the late 19th century. It certainly existed. But like most things, the Americans build on it, take it over, dismiss what the Spanish had done as purely irrelevant, as they always did, and ignored, but benefiting enormously from it at the same time, and then create but the beauty of this data is that it actually lists, I can't believe it, it actually lists the fires, the people who own the buildings, how the fire brigade was called, whether it was by telephone, by some other means, the way the way in which the fire brigade was what type of fire it was, what type of dwelling it was, and the cost of the damages. Now, this is a staggering sort of source. It's like a rich vein of minerals for a historical geographer, because here I can do all sorts of things with this. I mean, it tells me an awful lot. Of course, it does list nipa houses, but I mean, they're obviously going to be the most substantial, and clearly, people who lived in them maybe didn't contact the fire service anyhow. So we are only dealing with, I suspect, not all fires, but only a percentage of them. But still, it's a really, really rich source. At the same time, it also clearly shows how the American regime was trying to build a modern fire service, and that's very interesting in terms of training, and also so unfortunately, the really detailed accounts only last for 6 years, and then it gets subsumed into sort of rather general statistics. So you get the number of fires and this, that, and the other, but not this wonderful detail. of individual fires and owners, and all sorts of things I can do this. So I haven't started doing. I won't get round to it till later on in this year. But I'm very much looking forward to getting my teeth into that one, because I think it will be a very interesting. And again, when it comes to fire, I'm working at the moment on a couple of articles on fire in New Delhi, actually, where I've been doing some research, but contemporary research, not historical so much there, but it's made me very much aware of the legacy of fire organization, fire services on contemporary fire provision. So in the case of Delhi, one can clearly see the legacy of the British colonial fire service on the present fire service in New Delhi. And I suspect that I will be able to do similar things eventually in the Philippines too, and look at this legacy. And one of the classic things in New Delhi, for instance, is, and you become aware of it, and I suspect this is going to be very true in the Philippines too, is that you have a fire service that is designed by, as I said, colonial bureaucrats, modeled on their own sense of what fire is. And so it's reliant on large engines and roads that will get them there, and fire hydrants. Now, as all of us know, that most people in cities outside of the developed world, only some parts of the city are like that. So, in the case of, and I'm quoting from New Delhi because it's the data I have, sometimes the nearest a fire engine can get to the actual fire is 2 kilometers. So they have to put 2 kilometers of hoses well, you can imagine what the water pressure is like. It also, and they don't have hydrants, so the half the fire engines are actually off gathering water all the time and channeling it to the fire engine that is connected to the hose. So the whole thing is and that's a legacy of thinking about fire from a colonial perspective, when it doesn't exist for most of the city's residents. And I mean, that is clear. I remember once being stuck in a traffic jam in Pasay, I can't remember, somewhere in Manila anyhow. I mean, it was one of those gridlocks, and literally we're there for about 2 hours. And on the other side of the road, about 3 or 4 cars up, was a fire engine with its light going, and it was stuck there for 2 hours as well. And it made me think, whatever fire it was going to, it didn't make it. It would have long been, so we could then get into questions about traffic and things like that. So I suspect all these points will be relevant to the Philippines too. So I'm sort of working my way back, we could say, from the past back to the past, from the past to the future here, in looking at the incidence of fire in Manila. Fire again is an interesting disaster because it's not usually classified as a disaster either. And again, that's very interesting. If you look at things like the Red Crescent's World Disaster Reports, they do not list urban fire as a hazard. Wildfire, yes, but not urban fire. And yet urban fire is one of the most unreported natural hazards that there are. And it's very, very apparent, very prevalent in parts of Manila too, in the informal settlements that just don't get reported half the time. So I think it's one of those areas that interests me a lot.